On a Wednesday morning in August of 2018, Chad Brennan stood in front of his new 2018 Peterbilt 567 rotator wrecker and felt like he'd finally made it. The truck had arrived 3 days earlier on a flatbed hauler from the factory in Denton, Texas. It was painted midnight blue with chrome accents that caught the sun like mirrors. The Century 1150S rotator boom could lift 60 tons. The wireless remote control let you operate the entire rig from 50 feet away. The computer system monitored every hydraulic function, every load angle, every stress point. Total cost, $285,000, financed over 7 years at 6.2% interest. Chad was 34 years old, owner of Brennan Recovery Services in Grants Pass, Oregon. He'd started the business 5 years earlier with one used wrecker and a cell phone. Now he had 3 trucks, 2 employees, and this beast of a machine that could handle anything the southern Oregon mountains could throw at it. He stood there in his company polo shirt with the logo embroidered on the chest, looking at that Peterbilt, and thought, this is what success looks like. What he didn't know was that 12 miles away in a barn behind a small house on the Rogue River sat a 1953 Holmes 750 twin-boom wrecker that was about to teach him the difference between impressive and effective. Let me tell you about Chad Brennan first, because understanding him is the only way to understand what happened next. Chad grew up in Medford, worked at his uncle's tire shop through high school, learned about trucks and heavy equipment the way most kids learn about video games. He was good with his hands, good with mechanical things, but what he really loved was the idea of being his own boss. In 2013, at 29, he bought a used 2005 Freightliner wrecker for $48,000 with a loan his father co-signed. Started taking calls. Accidents on I-5, broken down are ARV's logging trucks with blown tires. He worked 80-hour weeks, slept 4 hours a night, built a reputation. By 2016, he'd paid off the Freightliner and bought a second truck. By 2017, he had 2 employees and enough steady business to justify the big purchase. Brand new rotator. The kind of truck that could handle the heavy recoveries that paid $3,000 to $5,000 per job. The kind of truck that made a statement. Chad drove it around Grants Pass the day it arrived, stopped at the diner where the other tow operators had coffee, pulled into the lot where everyone could see it, the chrome, the size, the technology. That's a serious piece of equipment, one of the older guys said. Top of the line, Chad replied. Computer-controlled everything. This truck can pull anything. One man at the counter didn't say anything. He was in his late 70s, wearing Carhartt overalls and a faded cap. He just looked at the Peterbilt through the window, then went back to his coffee. Chad noticed. You got something to say, Earl? Earl Hutchins looked up. Nice truck. But, no but, it's a nice truck. You don't think it can do the job? Earl smiled slightly. I think it can do a lot of jobs, just not all of them. Chad laughed. Earl, that rotator can lift 60 tons. It's got a computer that calculates load angles automatically. Remote control operation, what job can it do? The ones where the ground won't hold you, Earl said quietly. Or the ones where the computer says no. The other operators chuckled. Earl Hutchins was a legend in Southern Oregon. He'd run a tow service from 1955 to 1998. 43 years with the same truck. Pulled everything from Model A's to loaded log trucks out of every kind of trouble the mountains could create. He'd retired 20 years ago, but everyone still knew him. Everyone also knew he still had that old Holmes wrecker in his barn. And everyone thought he was crazy for keeping it. Earl, Chad said, trying to be respectful, I appreciate the old school wisdom, but that truck of yours is 65 years old. This is 2018. Technology's moved on. Has it? Earl stood up, dropped a few dollars on the counter for his coffee. Or has it just gotten more complicated? He walked out before Chad could respond. Let me tell you about Earl Hutchins and his 1953 Holmes 750, because the truck is as much a character and this story is the man. Earl bought the Holmes in 1955 for $6,800, used from a towing company in Portland that was upgrading to newer equipment. The truck was 2 years old, built on a 1953 Chevrolet 6400 chassis with a Holmes 750 twin-boom wrecker body. The twin booms were the key feature. 2 independent booms, one on each side of the truck, each with its own hand-cranked winch and 3/4-inch steel cable. The system was entirely mechanical, no hydraulics, no power assistance, just gears, cables, and human muscle. The truck weighed 18,000 pounds empty. It rode on 6 wheels with tall, narrow tires that distributed weight over a large surface area. The wheelbase was long, 197 inches, which spread the truck's weight even further. It had no computer, no sensors, no remote control, no automatic anything. What it did have was simplicity and reliability. When something broke, you could see what was broken. When something needed adjustment, you could adjust it with hand tools. When you needed to pull something, you cranked the winch handles, and the physics of mechanical advantage did the work. Earl had used that truck for 43 years, pulled thousands of vehicles. The only major repairs had been a clutch replacement in 1967, transmission rebuild in 1982, and new cables every 10 years. When he retired in 1998, at 58, Earl didn't sell the Holmes. He kept it in his barn, started it once a month, maintained it the way he'd always maintained it. People asked why. Because it still works, Earl said, and because someday someone's going to need it. That day came on August 15th, 2018. A logging truck, a Kenworth W900 with a loaded trailer carrying 40 tons of Douglas fir logs, had been coming down Highway 199 through the Siskiyou Mountains when the driver misjudged a curve. The truck went off the shoulder and rolled onto its side on a steep embankment about 30 feet below the road surface. The driver was shaken, but unhurt. The truck was on its side, wedged between trees, the trailer still attached and loaded. The embankment was loose rock and dirt, unstable, the kind of ground that shifted if you looked at it wrong. The highway patrol called Chad at 9:30 a.m. "We need heavy recovery on 199-mile marker 27, loaded log truck on its side." Chad was there by 10:15 with the Peterbilt rotator. He looked at the situation and felt confident. This was exactly the kind of job the rotator was built for. He positioned the Peterbilt at the edge of the embankment, extended the hydraulic outriggers to stabilize the truck, and began extending the boom. The computer screen in the cab showed load angles, stress calculations, ground pressure readings. Everything looked good. Chad hooked the main cable to the overturned Kenworth's frame and began the lift. The rotator's hydraulics whined as they took the load. The boom extended smoothly. The Kenworth began to shift. Then the warning alarm sounded. Ground instability detected. Chad looked at the screen. The right rear outrigger was sinking. The ground pressure sensor showed the pad punching through the surface into softer soil beneath. The computer automatically reduced hydraulic pressure to the boom. Safety protocol: prevent the rotator from tipping. Chad repositioned, moved the Peterbilt 10 feet to the left, extended the outriggers again. Same result. The moment serious load hit the boom, the outriggers on the downhill side began sinking. Ground instability detected. Load aborted. By noon, Chad had tried 4 different positions. Every time the same warning. The embankment was too soft. The Peterbilt, at 52,000 pounds fully rigged, was too heavy for the ground conditions. The highway patrol sergeant walked over. "What's the problem?" "Ground won't hold," Chad said. "My outriggers keep sinking. Computer won't let me continue the lift if the stability's compromised. Can you override it?" "Technically, yes, but if the truck tips, I'm looking at $250,000 in damage and possible injury. I'm not risking it." "So what do we do?" Chad pulled out his phone, started making calls. Portland had a larger rotator, a 75-ton unit, but it would take 6 hours to get there. Even then, there was no guarantee the ground would hold it either. "We might need to build a platform," Chad said. "Bring in steel plates, stabilize the ground, then bring in the heavy equipment. That's a 2-day job minimum." "Highway's closed," the sergeant said, "costing the county $15,000 a day. 2 days is $30,000. Chad felt the weight of it. This was supposed to be his moment. The big truck, the big recovery, the proof that he'd made it. Instead, his $285,000 rotator was sitting useless on the shoulder while a logging truck lay on its side and the highway stayed closed. That's when the 1978 Ford F250 pulled up. Early, Hutchins climbed out slowly. He was 78 years old and his knees didn't work like they used to. He walked to the edge of the embankment and looked down at the overturned Kenworth. "Heard on the scanner you had a situation," Earl said. Chad was frustrated. Yeah, ground's too soft. My rotator can't get stable footing. Earl nodded. Your truck weighs what, 25 tons rigged? 26. Outrigger pads, how big? 18 inches square. Standard for this class. Earl did the math in his head. So you're putting about 6,500 pounds per square foot on that soft ground. No wonder you're sinking. You got a better idea? I might. My Holmes weighs 9 tons rigged. Footprint's bigger because of the wheelbase and the tire contact. I'm putting maybe 1,800 pounds per square foot on the same ground. Chad stared at him. Earl, that truck's 65 years old. This is a 40-ton load. I know. I've pulled heavier. Your Holmes has what, maybe 10-ton capacity per boom? Rated capacity, yes, but I'm not lifting. I'm pulling. Different physics. And I've got 2 booms. I can distribute the load, pull from 2 angles simultaneously. Your rotators, pulling from 1 point. The highway patrol sergeant spoke up. Earl, you really think you can do this? Won't know until I try, but I'm lighter. I've got better ground contact, and my truck doesn't have a computer telling me no when I know it's yes. Chad wanted to argue. This was his job, his recovery, his chance to prove the investment was worth it, but he was out of options, and the clock was ticking. Fine, Chad said. Show me what that museum piece can do. Earl drove home, fired up the Holmes, and drove it back to the site. The trip took 45 minutes because the old truck's top speed was 45 miles per hour. By the time Earl arrived, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread that Earl Hutchins was bringing out the old Holmes for a heavy recovery. When the truck came around the curve, people actually pointed and took pictures. The 1953 Holmes 750 looked like something from a different world. The green paint had faded to a dusty sage. The twin booms stood up like the arms of a praying mantis. The chrome work had pitted to a soft gray. Everything about it looked old, but the engine sounded strong. The tires were in good shape, and Earl drove it with the confidence of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. Chad watched Earl position the Holmes at the embankment edge. No hydraulic outriggers, no stabilizers. Just 6 wheels on solid ground, the long wheelbase distributing weight like a bridge. Earl climbed out, walked to the back of the truck, and began uncoiling the cables from both booms. Heavy 3/4-inch steel cable, each line capable of 15 tons of pulling force. He walked down the embankment carefully, testing each step, reading the ground the way Chad read computer screens. At the overturned Kenworth, Earl hooked one cable to the front frame rail and one to the rear. 2 points of contact. 2 independent pulling vectors. He climbed back up, the 78-year-old man breathing hard but steady, and positioned himself between the 2 hand-crank winches. You're going to crank that by hand? Chad asked. That's how it works. Earl, that's a 40-ton truck down there. I'm not lifting 40 tons. I'm pulling maybe 15 at an angle with mechanical advantage from the boom position and the cable routing. Physics, son, leverage, and patience. Earl began to crank. The driver's side winch first taking up slack in the cable, then the passenger side equalizing tension, back and forth, slow and steady, each rotation of the crank pulling a few inches of cable onto the drum. The crowd watched in silence. The cables went taut. The Holmes's frame creaked but held. Earl kept cranking. Down in the embankment, the Kenworth shifted, not much. An inch, and then 2. Earl stopped, wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the cool mountain air, and adjusted his grip. Started cranking again. 15 minutes passed. The Kenworth had moved 5 feet, rotating slowly as the dual cables pulled it from 2 angles simultaneously. Chad's phone buzzed. Text messages from other tow operators who'd heard what was happening. Is Earl really pulling that log truck with the Holmes? Holy shit, is this for real? 30 minutes. The Kenworth was halfway up the embankment. Earl had stopped 3 times to rest, but he never looked uncertain, just tired. At 45 minutes, the logging truck crested the embankment edge and rolled onto level ground next to the, highway. The crowd erupted. Highway patrol officers clapping, loggers who'd been waiting to clear the road cheering. Even the Kenworth driver who'd been sitting on the guardrail in shock stood up and applauded. Earl cranked the winches in reverse, releasing tension, lowering the booms back to travel position. He coiled the cables slowly, methodically, the way he'd done it for 43 years. Chad walked over. He didn't know what to say. Earl broke the silence. Your rotator's a fine piece of equipment for the right job, but this wasn't the right job. Why not? Because the right job for that truck is solid ground, high-capacity lifts, situations where computer precision matters. This job needed lightweight, distributed pulling force, and an operator who could make decisions without asking a computer for permission. Chad looked at his Peterbilt sitting there with all its technology, all its capability, completely useless for this situation. I spent $285,000 on that truck. I spent $6,800 on mine in 1955. I've spent maybe another $12,000 in 63 years keeping it running. Total cost of ownership, about $19,000. But mine can do things yours can't. True, and mine can do things yours can't. Question is, which things matter more? The highway patrol sergeant approached with paperwork. Earl, what do we owe you? Whatever the usual rate is. Usual rate for a heavy recovery with a rotator is $4,500. That's Chad's rate. Mine's $400. That's what I used to charge. Earl, you just did a job nobody else could do. $400. Take it or leave it. The sergeant wrote the check. Earl folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and climbed into the Holmes. The old truck started on the first turn of the key, settled into its familiar idle, and Earl drove away at 45 miles per hour while everyone watched. Let me tell you what happened over the next 6 months, because that's where the real lesson lived. Chad couldn't stop thinking about that day. His $285,000 truck defeated by soft ground and safety computers. Earl's $19,000 truck pulling a 40-ton load with hand cranks and patience. But Chad also had payments. $3,847 per month for 7 years. He'd signed the loan papers thinking the rotator would open up bigger jobs, higher rates, more profit. Instead, he found himself limited. The Peterbilt was too heavy for remote recoveries on forest roads, too wide for some of the narrow mountain highways, too dependent on computer systems that occasionally malfunctioned. In September, the main hydraulic controller failed, a sensor issue. The truck was dead in the water. The dealer said the part would take 3 weeks to arrive from the manufacturer. Cost $3,400. Chad had 2 big jobs scheduled that week. He had to subcontract them to another company, losing $8,000 in revenue. In November, the rotator's computer system needed a software update. The dealer charged $1,200 for the update and the diagnostic time. In January 2019, one of the outrigger hydraulic cylinders developed a leak. Dealer repair, $2,800. By March, Chad had owned the Peterbilt for 8 months. He'd made $46,000 in payments. He'd spent $11,400 in repairs and updates. He'd lost $8,000 in subcontracted work. Total cost, $65,400 in 8 months. Meanwhile, Earl had used the Holmes twice more. Once to pull a Toyota 4Runner out of a ravine where the access road was too narrow for modern wreckers. Once to recover a vintage logging truck for a museum, a delicate operation where the hand-cranked winches allowed precision that hydraulic systems couldn't match. Earl charged $400 each time, spent $80 on fuel and $0 on repairs because nothing broke. In April 2019, Chad did something he'd never thought he'd do. He called Earl. I need to ask you something, Chad said. Would you be willing to teach me how to operate the Holmes? Earl was quiet for a moment. Why? Because I'm starting to understand that I bought the wrong tool, or not the wrong tool, but not the complete set of tools. I need to know how to do what you do. You want to buy an old wrecker? Maybe first I want to understand how they work, how you think about recoveries differently, how you succeeded for 43 years with equipment that everyone says is obsolete. Earl considered. Come by Saturday morning. Bring work gloves. Let me tell you about those Saturdays because they changed everything. Every Saturday for 3 months, Chad drove to Earl's property on the Rogue River. Earl taught him how to read ground, conditions by feel instead of sensors, how to calculate load angles in his head instead of relying on computer readouts, how to use mechanical advantage instead of brute hydraulic force. Most importantly, Earl taught him about simplicity. "This truck," Earl said one morning, his hand on the Holmes's faded hood, "doesn't have a computer that can malfunction, doesn't have sensors that can fail, doesn't have software that needs updating. When something breaks, I can see what broke. When something needs fixing, I fix it with hand tools." "But it's slower," Chad said. "Hand cranking takes longer than hydraulics." "Does it? How long did your hydraulic controller failure cost you? 3 weeks, right?" "My hand crank has never failed in 63 years. So which is actually slower? The thing that works every time at a steady pace, or the thing that works fast until it doesn't work at all?" Chad didn't have an answer. By July 2019, Chad had made a decision. He started looking for an old wrecker. Not to replace the Peterbilt, but to complement it. To have a tool for the jobs where modern equipment was the wrong solution. He found a 1965 Holmes 600 in Eastern Oregon. Single boom, mechanical winch, Chevrolet C60 chassis. It had been restored by a collector who decided he wanted the garage space more than the truck. Price, $28,000. Chad bought it with cash he'd saved. No loan, no payments, no interest. The first time he used it was in August for a recovery on a Forest Service road where the ground was too soft for the Peterbilt. The Holmes 600 handled it easily. Chad hand-cranked the winch for 20 minutes and pulled out a stuck Jeep Wrangler. The owner paid $200. Chad spent $15 in fuel. Profit, $185. No computer, no sensors, no dealer dependencies, just mechanical advantage and patience. By 2020, Chad was using both trucks strategically. Peterbilt for the big highway recoveries on solid ground. Holmes 600 for the remote, difficult, soft ground jobs. His revenue increased because he could take jobs other companies refused, but the payments on the Peterbilt still ground on. $3,847 every month for 7 years. In March 2022, 4 years into the loan, Chad had paid $184,656. He still owed $100,344. The truck's market value had depreciated to $140,000. The Holmes 600, which he'd bought for $28,000 cash in 2019, was now worth $32,000. Appreciated, not depreciated, because old mechanical equipment in good condition was becoming rare. Let me tell you about the day Chad paid off the Peterbilt, because it was both a celebration and a reckoning. True to me. 7 years of payments. Chad's final check to the finance company. $3,847. Total paid over 7 years. $323,556 for a truck he'd bought for $285,000. $38,556 in interest alone. The truck was now worth about $95,000. He'd paid $323,556 for something worth $95,000. Net loss, $228,556. The Holmes 600 he'd bought for $28,000 cash in 2019 was now worth $38,000. Net gain, $10,000. The 1953 Holmes that Earl still drove occasionally was worth $65,000 to collectors. Earl had paid $6,800 in 1955 and spent $12,000 in maintenance over 70 years. Total, $18,800. Net gain, $46,200. Chad sat in his office looking at these numbers. 7 years of his life, $323,556 in payments. And he'd learned that the most expensive tool wasn't the most effective tool. The most effective tool was the one you could afford to own, maintain yourself, and use without permission from a computer. That evening, Chad drove to Earl's house. Earl was in his barn, changing the oil in the Holmes. He was 85 now, moving slower, but still maintaining the truck. "Earl," Chad said, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "You were right about everything, the computers. The complexity, the payments, all of it." Earl wiped his hands on a rag. "Took you 7 years to figure that out?" "Took me 7 years to admit it." Chad sat down on an old wooden stool. "I just made my last payment on the Peterbilt. $323,556 total. The truck's worth $95,000 now. I lost $228,556. Earl whistled low. That's more than I made in my best 5 years of business combined. I know. And the whole time I watched you pull jobs with a truck that cost you $18,800 over 70 years. A truck that's now worth more than you paid for it. So what are you going to do? I don't know. Keep both trucks, I guess. Use them for what they're good at. Maybe buy another old one. Maybe stop chasing the newest technology and start appreciating the simplest solution. Earl nodded. That's wisdom talking. But let me ask you something. If you could go back to 2018, would you still buy the Peterbilt? Chad thought about it. Honestly, no. I'd buy 3 old wreckers for the same money. Have tools for every situation. No payments. No dealer dependencies. More capability. Less complexity. Why 3? 1 twin boom like yours for soft ground recoveries. 1 heavy-duty single boom for highway work. 1 light wrecker for local calls. Total investment, maybe $80,000. All paid cash, all maintainable myself. All tools I control instead of tools that control me. Earl smiled. Now you're thinking like someone who wants to own a business instead of someone who wants to look like they own a business. The words hit hard because they were true. Let me tell you what happened in the 2 years that followed, because this is where the story reaches its end. Earl Hutchins died in November 2026 at the age of 86. Heart failure in his sleep, the way everyone hopes to go. His funeral was attended by 300 people. Every tow operator in Southern Oregon came. So did dozens of people he'd helped over 43 years of service. In his will, Earl left the 1953 Holmes 750 to Chad Brennan with one condition. Never sell it, never restore it beyond maintaining its working condition. Use it, teach others with it, pass it on to someone who understands what it represents. Chad accepted the truck with tears in his eyes. He now runs Brennan Recovery with 4 trucks. The 2018 Peterbilt rotator paid off, still useful for certain jobs. The 1965 Holmes 600, the 1953 Holmes 750, and a 1972 International Lodestar flatbed wrecker he bought in 2027 for $15,000 cash. 3 of his 4 trucks are over 50 years old. Combined purchase price, $49,800. Combined maintenance cost per year, about $3,200. None of them have computers. None of them require dealer service. None of them have payments. When new operators ask Chad for advice, he tells them Earl's story. Shows them the Holmes 750. Lets them hand crank the winches. This truck, Chad says, is 73 years old. It's pulled thousands of loads. It's never had a computer failure because it doesn't have a computer. It's never needed a software update because it doesn't have software. It's never been to a dealer because there are no dealers for 1953 Holmes wreckers, just mechanics who understand basic machines. So I should buy an old wrecker? They ask. You should understand what you're buying and why. New equipment is impressive. It's powerful. It's advanced. But it's also expensive, complex, and dependent. Old equipment is simple. It's maintainable. It's yours, not the bank's, not the dealer's. Yours. Which is better? Depends on what you value. Looking successful or being successful. Impressing people or serving people. Owning tools or tools owning you. The 1953 Holmes 750 still runs. Chad uses it 3 or 4 times a year for jobs where soft ground, narrow access, or delicate pulling requires the precision of hand-cranked winches and the light footprint of old engineering. Every time he uses it, someone asks, is that thing safe? Or, does that even work? Or, why don't you use your modern truck? Chad's answer is always the same. This truck works because it was built to work, not to impress. And 73 years later, it's still doing the job it was built for. How many modern machines can say that? The rotator record dealers still say you need the latest model. The finance companies still offer 7-year loans at attractive rates. The technology keeps advancing, computers getting smarter, systems getting more complex. And somewhere in Southern Oregon, a 73-year-old wrecker with twin booms and hand-crank winches keeps pulling loads that modern equipment can't touch. not because it's better at everything, but because sometimes the best tool is the one that doesn't need permission, doesn't need updates, doesn't need a dealer, and doesn't need anything except an operator who understands that simple machines maintained well last longer than complex machines built to impress. Earl Hutchins understood that for 71 years. Chad Brennan learned it the hard way. And now every time someone brings their shiny new rotator to a job and discovers the ground won't hold it, Chad fires up the Holmes 750 and proves that some lessons are worth $228,556 to learn.